The good folks at Comics for Fun and Profit have been doing 2 episodes a week for quite some time now, and it's all thanks to, first of all, Jason, and second of all, our patrons who allow us to add the space on our server, broadcast more, store more, share more with you, the listeners. I'm envious of those of you who have unlimited storage and media server capabilities. We pay for ours here at the C4 FAP. It ain't cheap. We thank you so much for those of you who go to patreon.com/comicsfunprofit and contribute at any level to say thanks, to say, I want to be a part of your Slack channel conversations. I want to get exclusives. I want to get early access. I want to get ad-free access. I want to get swag. I want to get some free stuff. Whatever your reasoning is, we appreciate it at any level because it does make a difference. So from the bottom of Kyle and I and Jason's heart, thank you for contributing.
Aloha! This is Jason from Hawaii. Welcome to a special edition of the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast. In this episode, I will be interviewing writer Mathew Klickstein. He is here to promote his new book, See You at San Diego, an oral history of Comic-Con, Fandom, and the Triumph of the Geek Culture. Now, this book is by Fantagraphics. Now, for me, I've read some of the book. It's incredible. This is a time capsule softback book that is 480 pages. It's filled with amazing pictures, and it tells the story of Comic-Con, warts and all, from the early grassroots beginnings to present day. Mathew, it is an honor to have you on the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. First off, how are you doing today?
Doing just fine. Thank you, Jason.
And you know what? And I forgot to ask you this before we started recording. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
You did. Thank you. You're actually one of the few who does. Honestly, it's not that big a deal for me. In fact, I used to, when I was very young, I went by Matt Klickstein because I was weirdly obsessed with Frankenstein. I used to always dress up as him for Halloween, and I used to take out all these books on old monster movies from the library when I was a kid, to the point that the librarian and my 3rd grade teacher had a meeting with my mom about it because they were worried I was reading too much about monsters, to which my mom, of course, responded, let me get this straight. You had me come to school to talk to me because you're worried my son reads too much. Yeah. But I noticed my dad always said Klickstein, and I started realizing maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong. And I actually asked my grandfather at one point how it was pronounced, and he said he didn't know either. Don't want to go down the rabbit hole really here, but Jewish. So a lot of us, our names were given to us at
Yes.
Ellis Island, and they weren't always, we didn't really, they were sort of made up. So
Yes.
I did once read an essay by Tom Wolfe, though, where he interviewed Leonard Bernstein, and Bernstein claimed that Stein is the original Jewish and Steen is like the Americanized version of it. So I don't know, but personally, I don't really care. But it is funny because a lot of times people will ask me before an interview, is it Steen or Stein?
Yeah.
I say Steen, and they inevitably usually say Stein anyway. I also get Klickenstein a lot, probably because it's similar to Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that you got it right the first time without even asking. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm just going to go over your brief history, to let listeners know to check out your other works. And, as you mentioned before we recorded that, you wrote the book Slime, an oral history of Nickelodeon's golden age. Is that correct?
That is correct. That came out through Penguin Random House in 2013. There's also an audiobook version of it, and I still don't know how this happened, but it was actually a clue on Jeopardy just a few weeks ago. It was literally, the question had something to do with subtitled books. That mine was one of them. They said Slime, they said Nickelodeon. I actually don't watch Jeopardy. So I had friends all over the country texting me about it and saying, hey, did you know your book was on Jeopardy? And even a friend of mine who I had no idea watched Jeopardy either. He records every episode. So he actually filmed it on his phone when it happened. Nice. And so I got to see it. But so Slimed Slime was, I did a few other smaller books before that, but Slime was really my first big book that really kind of
Mhm.
kickstarted my career as a pop culture historian. Yeah, for
Mhm.
that one, we talked to 250 people. We got Mark Summers, of course, from Double
Yes.
Dare to do the forward.
Mhm.
Some really great pictures in that one too. That's probably one of the books that I'm most known for. It's like the only book really on Nickelodeon aside from some academic texts that came out.
Mhm.
Yeah, so yeah, I did do Slimed.
Okay. And then also too, on the comic book side, for Aftershock, you wrote the comic book limited series "You Are Obsolete." Is it? Did I
I
get that
did,
correct?
yeah. That came out 2 or 3 years
Mhm.
ago. In fact, the OGN came out during COVID, which was interesting,
Okay.
especially because it dealt with a lot of issues that kind of turned out to be very prescient about screens and about technology. It's
Yes.
basically the easy log line is it's essentially Children of the Corn, but instead of the Bible or religion, it's cell phones. It's just,
Oh,
it was just this
nice.
idea I had. I was originally pitching it around as a film. I was
Mhm.
getting a lot of really positive feedback on it, but of course, getting a film made, especially these days, is extremely difficult
Yes.
and for the finances. And I had a number of friends in the comic book industry, including Tim Seeley, who
Mhm.
later would be part of this book, See You at San
Mhm.
Diego. And Tim and a few other people helped me to connect me to Aftershock, with whom they'd worked before. A couple of my other friends had done some stuff for them also. And they were very welcoming over there. And I had actually never written a comic book. The funny thing is, I don't really read comic books. I didn't
Mhm.
then or now. I like underground comics quite a
Mhm.
lot and certain other like graphic novels and things like
Yes.
that, but regular comic books have never really been my jam. So they actually had to have me learn how to write one because they knew I could do scripts and I'd done
Mhm.
film and television and theater and obviously a lot of books and articles, but never a comic book script.
Mhm.
So they actually sent me a few just to see if I could do it. And I wrote
Mhm.
the first issue actually completely on spec, totally on my own without any development,
Mhm.
and they loved it and they bought the whole series. And then I worked on the next four. It
Mhm.
was five altogether with an editor, Christina Harrington, and some of the other people at Aftershock kind of helped me out. There wasn't too many notes. I mean, I
Sure.
really was able to translate the work that I'd done in film and television and theater to comic books
Mhm.
pretty easily. And like I said, although I'm not really into the mainstream comics, I do read underground and graphic novels. So I had an
Mhm.
idea, and they're it's essentially like film on the
Yes.
page. So I
Yeah.
knew how to explain how I wanted to look, and I worked
Mhm.
closely with the art department, and I sent them samples of pictures and images that they can use.
Yeah.
I wanted it to reference a lot of
Mhm.
70s and 80s horror films and Twilight Zone, so I would send them clips from
Oh
different
my
movies and
God.
images, and they did. I mean, you could look. I mean, the front cover of You Are Obsolete, you can tell, is a bit of a rip from John Carpenter's version of Village of the Damned, and
Mhm.
there's scenes that are
Yes.
right out of like Poltergeist,
Mhm.
and even the
Mhm.
third issue is very much the rubric of the cover, and
Mhm.
because I told them to, is based very much on an old Spanish film from 1973 called Who Could Kill a Child. And actually, there's a Spanish language version of the OGN, and I saw
Yeah.
some people in Spanish language countries talking about
Yeah.
that cover, and I wanted it to be self-referential. They're talking about movies a lot, so I wanted it to be very obvious that we
Mhm.
were kind of paying homage, not ripping
Mhm.
off, but paying homage to these other films and television shows, and especially Twilight Zone was a big one for me. So
That's nice. Okay, so Matt, I'm gonna say because you've already covered a couple things that what started off like literally the history of Comic Con, monster books, underground comics, and so forth. And so, but I'm gonna say I'm just gonna go. Let me just finish up a couple more things. I just want to point out is I want to give a shout out. A big shout out to Hannah Bahedri of Superfan Promotions for setting up this interview and for an advanced reading copy. So, Hannah, thank you very much. Matthew, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, there's a million people to thank. Anyone who's seen the book knows that the acknowledgement section is about 4 or 5 pages long, and
Yes.
it's not just a 480-page book as you've seen. It's big. It's very tall. Like everyone who sees it is amazed by how big it is, including myself. When I first
Hmm.
got a copy of it, I had no idea it was going to be that huge.
Hmm.
And it's double columns. So I
Yes.
had a lot of people to thank who really helped me to get this going for this particular interview. Definitely, I mean, obviously yourself, definitely Hannah, David Hyde,
Hmm.
who's her boss, who runs Superfan, and he's been great. Gary Groff, my publisher, of course, who was also the
Yes.
supervisory editor on it, and we've become very good friends. I'm now going to be working with him on another project. I can talk about that later if you
Yeah.
want. So definitely Gary and, just all the people at Fantagraphics who helped make this happen. And if I named every single person who's in the book or who helped me make the book, again, I'd have to read about 6 pages of double column, 12 long. So I'll just say I'm very thankful of everyone who helped me to put this together. And it was a challenging time, especially since it came from originally, the podcast series of SiriusXM
Yes.
Comic Con Begins that we did literally during COVID. And in fact, we started it right at the height of that. So that was it's been a very intense last 3 years doing the podcast and now the book.
Yeah.
And there's even an audiobook version that just came out through a company called Blackstone. So I've been really living in this story for a very long time. And even before that, like I said, even though I'm not a big comics guy, I've always been very interested in comics as a community. I've always read a lot of biographies and autobiographies and interviews with people like Alan Moore and obviously people like Kirby and Stan Lee and others, Neil Adams. So I'm more like an anthropologist. I'm not as interested in the work, but I'm very interested in the people and the community. Frank Miller. I mean, a lot of the people even that I got in the book, I'm fascinated by who they are as people and what they're doing on as like almost like a movement as opposed to the actual work itself. There's some classic, or modern classics, if you will, comic series that I've enjoyed. I love The Killing Joke, for example. Good Alan Moore one, and a few others. I bought a Death of Superman comic when it came out in '93. I would always hang out. I like to say this too. I would always hang out at comic book shops when I was a kid. It's part of why I made the book the way that it is, where I really focus on the community. Yes. And I've always told people that though I wasn't really into comics as a kid, I still hung out at comic book shops a lot because that's where all the other geeks were. Yes. And especially some of the older ones who would tell me, like, they weren't just talking about comics, they were talking about movies, they were talking about TV shows, they were talking about animation, anime, manga, tabletop games. And unlike record stores and video stores, which I also like poking into, what's great about a comic book shop, of course, is there are people hanging out and there's tables and people are playing games and there's TVs on with like oftentimes really cool stuff, old movies and old TV and great old animation. It's not sports, it's cool TV that we like. And so I would end up really hanging out at comic book shops. So even though I wasn't reading a lot of that stuff, it still filtered through kind of through mimosa, through like a mimetic kind of a thing going on and osmosis. And, and that's kind of how I wanted the book to be too, where I was really focusing less on the materials and more on the community. Yes. And that someone who's not really that into comics could still be very much a part of this and be very interested in it. I will say I've always been a huge science fiction guy. So that's kind of my more hardcore kind of traditional geek cred is, I watched Twilight Zone since I was a child. My mom and I watched it together, 4 or 5 years old. Loved Ray Bradbury, love Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Philip K. Dick. People like that. So I definitely have my geek cred on a more hardcore level with the science fiction. That's something that I'm very pure on. So
I'm gonna touch upon that when we start getting in more, when like the early days. And listeners, basically, I mean, we only have so little time. I'm just going to.
Sorry, I know I talk a lot.
No, Matt, no.
Yeah, girl is.
No. Because the thing is, because for listeners, it's like, I just want to give the listeners an idea of like where this book is great. Like I said, I just want to focus on like just the early days of how it came about, and then just go ahead and pick up the book because, like I said, because me and Matthew are talking like we could do this whole episode could be 4 or 5 hours long.
I agree with that. That's true.
So, Matthew, I'm going to ask, like, what inspired? Because, like you said, you're like an anthropologist, and so forth. What inspired you to write this book? Like, what was the thing that kicked it off for you?
As we were just talking about, I did the Nickelodeon book. As you know, maybe some of your listeners know, I also did something similar about The Simpsons with Mike Reiss, who's one of 2 people who's written for the show since it started.
Yes.
Springfield Confidential. It's not quite an oral history, but I did have an opportunity to interview a lot of other people like Conan O'Brien and Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer, and Nancy Cartwright, the voice of Bart Simpson, of course, for that book. And I've done a lot of articles and things over the years as well. documentaries. I call myself, and I've been called, a pop culture historian, along with a few other friends of mine, some of whom are in the book, like Cassine Gaines, who does similar projects on like Back to the Future, and he just had an ET book. So there's a kind of a handful of us who really take this stuff very seriously, and it's very important for us because, of course, as you know, whether it's podcasts, even documentaries, certainly books and articles these days, it seems like over the last few years, a lot of the people who are engaging in these materials are doing it from a much more subjective and personal place, which, sometimes has its place. But, if I'm going to watch a movie or read a book on, say, the Wonder Years, for example, I don't necessarily want to watch a movie or read a book on what that author or what the filmmaker has to say themselves about Wonder Years, and maybe they throw in a couple of random interviews. I really want everyone who's involved to talk about it and really have the text, whether again it's a documentary, a podcast, or a book, that's going to be the resource. It's going to be the encyclopedia for that. And unfortunately, this is a whole other discussion, but a lot of it's for marketing reasons and social media and whatnot, influencer ecosystem. There's just not a lot of them these days. And, some of it is they take a lot of time. They're a lot of work. Look, if I were going to write, a bunch of personal essays about what I think about Comic-Con, that would have taken me a month. But to do it as a real resource that PhD students are going to be using for their thesis, and that years from now, when other people kind of catch on to what this resource is, it's going to be all over the place, like the Nickelodeon book has been and the Simpsons book has been. Just takes some time. I want it to be very accurate. I really want it to be the people who made it. And so where I'm going with all this is I take pop culture history very seriously. I always have. I was the kid in elementary school who was reading books about Chuck Jones and George Burns and all different kinds of things at a very young age. And I wanted to do that kind of stuff. Cassine and some of my other friends have similar stories of they were reading books about Twilight Zone and such as a kid. And so that's why they wanted to do it. And I realized, what can I do that would be kind of the ultimate pop culture history book that would sort of bring all of this together, all the different fandom fiefdoms together, all the different communities, Star Wars, Star Trek, comic books, science fiction, Mad Magazine, Rick and Morty, cartoons, animation, Twilight Zone, all of it. And I realized that it's certainly comics, DC, Marvel, everything, underground comics. What can I do to really tell the full story in a way that would work and that wouldn't take me 100 years and that wouldn't be 50,000 pages? And I realized I could do it through the lens of the prehistory, history, and expansion of the largest pop culture gathering worldwide, which according to the Guinness Book of World Records twice in the last few years is Comic-Con, is San Diego Comic-Con. I happen to know somebody, Wendy All, A-L-L, who was one of the original committee members. She's all over the book, as you've seen. And she and I were old friends. I'd interviewed her a lot. She was somebody that I was close with. And she helped me to get in touch with everybody and kind of came on as my historical consultant and agreed after the 50th anniversary of Comic-Con, now was the time to do it, especially as, sad but true, we're starting to lose people. And it's like, we got to get this stuff down now. And again, that's why it was so important for me, not only to do it and to do it now and to get as many people involved as possible before they're gone, but why, again, I didn't want to just do it as kind of my take on it. I really wanted to be their story. I almost don't even like calling myself on a project like this, like the writer or the author. They're the writers, they're the authors, they're the storytellers. I'm really more of a curator or an editor cutting it all together. If this were a documentary, I would be, the director, producer, but I don't necessarily know if I'd call myself writer per se. So that's where it came from. I wanted to do the ultimate pop culture history book, and this was that.
And then that's the perfect segue, because because I wanted you to describe the format of the book, because I didn't know how to, because listeners, it's not just the typical, in 1973 in August, we met at this bar thing. Oh, and also, so how do you describe the format of the book? You mentioned it's like,
so Sure. As per the subtitle, it's an oral history, which is a relatively new literary form. I mean, in some ways it does go back at least as far as people like Studs Terkel, and books on people like Edie Sedgwick and Truman Capote that were done in the 50s and 60s and later on. Legs McNeil did an incredible oral history back in the 90s called Please Kill Me, about punk rock. There's a guy named James Andrew Miller, who's something of a hero of mine, who's done
Mhm.
huge oral histories on everything from Saturday Night Live to ESPN to just recently HBO. And what it is the best way to say it is, if you think about it as a talking heads documentary, where you have all the different interviewees who are
Mhm.
talking and telling their story. It's all cut together.
Yes.
Maybe you have some archival stuff, whatever, but really the focus is all the people in their interviews. So
Yes.
I do the exact same thing, except instead of a documentary, it's a book. So think of
Mhm.
it as if this were a documentary, but I transcribed all the interviews
Yes.
after they have been cut together.
Mhm.
And a lot of my work, aside from the producerial stuff where I'm getting everyone and tracking them down and setting up
Mhm.
interviews and doing the interviews and such, is really taking all the transcripts of all their interviews. So I'll talk to each person for 2 or 3 hours
Mhm.
sometimes, do some pickups occasionally. Hey,
Yeah.
someone said this about this.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about that? And so
Mhm.
I'll go back to the same person sometimes a couple times. Once I have all the interviews done, I transcribe it all and
Mhm.
then I cut them together just like I'd be cutting together a documentary, except
Mhm.
instead of cutting film or video, I'm cutting the actual words to
Mhm.
tell the full story. A really good example of what I mean, and then I can wrap this up here, is there's a really great part that I love just for the format, which is I talked to Kevin Eastman, the co-creator of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Stan Sakai, who also did our forward, the creator of Usagi
Mhm.
Yojimbo. And they both, during their interviews, partly intentionally on my part, but partly they just talked about it, discussed when Stan's Usagi Yojimbo ended up becoming a part of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles universe, as most
Mhm.
people probably know who are listening to this, and really how that helped Stan and helped Usagi really get out there on a larger level.
Mhm.
And they both talked about it in a very similar way because it
Mhm.
was a similar story. And I kind of cut them together back and forth,
Yes.
almost like a ping pong match.
Yeah.
And as you had said before we started the recording, and a lot of other people said too, it really feels like you're almost there. So it would
Mhm.
feel like you're sitting at a bar or coffee shop with Stan Sakai and Kevin Eastman,
Mhm.
and they're almost completing each other's sentences. And
Yes.
that was really for me the work that I have to do, is to make sure to get those interviews done right, but
Mhm.
also later to cut them together in a way that not only tells the full story,
Mhm.
but in a way that flows well, that keeps it
Mhm.
moving, that's
Yes.
organic, that's not going to get sluggish,
Mhm.
um, and that it doesn't feel like it's two. It almost feels like one person's talking
Mhm.
rather than two people going back and forth.
Yes.
So, and that's the kind of thing I did throughout the entire book. Also, the opposite is true, which I really like about oral histories as well, which is there are times, as you've seen probably in the book, where people disagree with each other. Also,
Yes.
like what would happen if you were at a coffee shop or a bar with some of these people.
Yeah.
There are times where someone might say something and someone else says, no, it didn't happen like that. It
Mhm.
happened like this.
Yes.
And that happens frequently. And that's a big part too, why I both like to write and to read
Mhm.
oral histories, because it's oftentimes very hard, if not impossible, to know exactly what happened,
Yeah.
especially
Yes.
with something like the early days of Comic Con. We're talking about a bunch of kids. We're talking about 50 years ago. Nothing was recorded, nothing was written down.
Mhm.
They barely even had anyone taking pictures or anything, or any film or video. Of course, video wasn't even really around yet.
Mhm.
So a lot of it's just based on people's memories, and
Yeah.
people's memories are different. And
Yeah.
or someone might say, no, it didn't happen quite like that. And so that's really the fun of an oral history, is both people can kind of be bouncing back and forth, but also people can kind of
Mhm.
uh, exaggerate each other's stuff, or disagree with each other, contradict each other. And I think
Mhm.
that's really important to tell the full story.
It is. It's and listeners, it is. You know. You know. I just want to say this because I want to start getting into the book, Matthew. But like I said, this book is great. I just feel like I felt like when I'm reading, so I felt like I thought I was like sitting at the table with all these founding members, committee members. It was great, um, and it's warts and all. It's not
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, I remember we did this and it was so fun, but it was like, no, I remember. Oh yeah, I remember when he did this. Oh God, But it's
No,
warts and all.
there's some dark stuff in there.
Yeah,
There's some
and
disappointing stuff in there. There's some sad stuff. People die. People got married and divorced. I mean, it's, I don't have to tell any of the listeners here, even beyond Comic-Con, obviously, just stories about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and
Yeah.
what happened to the Superman guys and Bill Finger and, or even outside of the comics realm, of course. I mean, just things that have happened over the years in Hollywood and so forth. So there's certainly a lot there. And, even in discussing Comic-Con, there's a lot of discussion. I mean, there's an entire chapter about the founder, Shel Dorf. And, he was a controversial guy. And, some people loved him and some people hated him and really hated him. I mean, there are people who a few of the people who had some very negative things to say about them, I either knew just because I got to know them well, or would actually ask them, "Are you sure you want me to put this in?" Because I didn't want to make anyone look too bad or anything. And they were like, "Yeah, I want that to be known that I really dislike that person a lot." And Shell was not the only one that was true of course, but because he was such a Citizen Kane type of character and so nuanced, and there was a lot of good and a lot of bad. I will say, and this is the point made in that chapter and throughout the book, that I think it's very interesting that the people who really disliked him quite a lot, wish they never met him, are glad he's dead, still said that there would not be a Comic-Con without Sheldorf. Every single one. There's two people, and I'll let people read the book to find out, in particular, that really disliked Shell quite a lot. And I've gotten to know both of them quite well, and they really mean it. I mean, they almost obsess over him in a way. And both of them, along with everyone else, agree that, to his credit, though, there wouldn't be a Comic-Con without Shell. And so that says a lot, that even his biggest haters still give him that credit.
Yes. And I'm gonna start getting into the book, because I'm gonna start off, and actually I only took a part of the quote from, actually this is the last quote from the final page of the book, is that Shell Dorf says, and I'm using a partial quote to fit this, is that we have created this yearly event with a specific object of sharing in mind. This one place where you can feel at home, share your likes and dislikes during the next 3 days. Now, of course, remember, ladies and listeners, this is years ago when this came out, or when he said this. Many of you will make friends, and perhaps lifelong friends will be formed right here at this convention. This has happened before. So again, listeners, as Matthew said, and Shell, how do you pronounce his last name?
Dorf, Dorf. Yep.
Was the guy who literally was the founder of Comic-Con.
Yeah, everyone would agree. It's a little hard to say exactly, just because so many people were involved in the creation of it. And there's even a section where some of the other people are considered co-founders, are like, well, I don't know if I would consider myself a co-founder. So, I'm a co-originator, just because it really was a bunch of kids who just wanted to put together this gathering where they could meet their heroes like Kirby and Ray Bradbury and Forey Ackerman and others. Forey Ackerman, who created famous Monsters of Filmland and Vampirella, amongst others. And I mean, they were children. Some of them were as young as 12 years old, like Gary Alfonso, who was not getting coffee for people. He was doing publicity. He was competing with the local media and such. I mean, they all had to have their moms drive them around and whatnot. So, but at the end of the day, even with some of the confusion and lack of recordings back then and whatnot, everyone does agree that Shell Dorf should be considered the founder. Although there were a lot of people, like at least a good group of about 6 or 7 people, who really also helped to make it happen, whether it was helping to get the funding that was needed or the ideas for it. I mean, there are even some, and this kind of came up in the MTV oral history, I Want My MTV, that came out a few years ago as well. They talked about the same thing about who really created MTV. Even that's kind of hard to say. And I found a similar kind of thing even with Nickelodeon, because with something like this, it's so hard to say because there's so many different people involved. And there was different iterations of it as well. It wasn't even called Comic-Con at first. They actually had this weird little mini con to raise money for. I mean, there was so many different things going on, so many different moving elements. But through all of that, it's pretty much the standard coda, that Shell Dorf is the founder, like, period. And I think some of that give it to him also just because they maybe feel a little bit bad that he didn't have much else going on in his life, from everything I understand. And there's even kind of a sad part. This is one of the warts and all parts, where one of the other people who helped to really get it going in the beginning, one of the other adults in the room, Shell was the adult at 36.
Yes.
Everyone else was like a kid.
Yeah.
But Shell was 36. There was another guy named Ken Kruger, and
Yes.
he's long passed, but we did get to talk to his son Gus, who was very helpful for this, and has done some promotional events with us and whatnot. But Ken was really pretty much one of the guys helping to fund it because, again, he was one of the other adults, just could, and also had a bookstore that everyone kind of hung out at,
That's right.
where they sort of met each other and kind of
Yes.
used as their clubhouse when they're coming up with the idea for Comic Con. And the sad part in the book is when Gus Kruger, Ken's son, says, or someone else says it, actually, it's Jim Valentino, I'm sorry, who would go on to help to create Image Comics, of course. He was another early Comic Con guy. But he said he once actually asked Ken, so many people did so many things. Why Ken did you give kind of the credit to Shell as the founder? And Ken said something along the lines of, I have my wife, I have my kids, I have my house, I have other work that I do. Shell's got nothing else. Like this is all Shell's got. And I think a lot of people felt that way about him. I mean, especially toward the end of Shell's life, it sounds like I never met the man. I never talked to him. He died in 2009. I mean, I don't, and there's very few recordings of him. There's not a lot of them out there. And it seems like, things got pretty tough for him toward the end. As much as he also apparently did some things that really upset a lot of people, his story sounds kind of like somewhat of a sad one. But he also created Comic-Con. So that's one thing we can give him. And I haven't been able to confirm this, but I know I read this somewhere, I heard of it, and it kind of makes sense. But from what I understand, Shell on Big Bang Theory and Young Sheldon is named after Sheldorf. I haven't been able to confirm that, but I'm certain. I've been researching this and reading about it for years. I actually did an article for Bleeding Cool a few years ago about this, and I've done similar kinds of projects in the past since 2014 about kind of Comic-Con and like things talking about this. And I really remember reading that somewhere and in a reliable source, like not Wikipedia or anything. So I can't remember where I saw it. I've tried finding it. I can't, but I'm quite certain, and it makes sense because I know some of the people involved in Big Bang Theory, and they definitely are all surprise, big Comic-Con people. So I believe that's possible, but maybe that's part of the mythology of it all. But I think that Shell is named after Sheldorf.
All right. Sorry, Matthew. Let me just, I just want to close this little section up and start talking about the mini con. So basically, listeners, I'm just encouraging you to pick up the book because, as Matthew said, that there's a lot of people that were involved in the very early day and literally high schoolers. I mean, these weren't businessmen. These were high schoolers who had literally, and forgive me, and I don't mean to offend anybody, literally had no idea what to do. It was kind of like, hey, let's get a band together.
They said the same thing. And you got to remember, not only were they kids, and some of them were junior high, like Barry Alfonso, who was 12. He was 12 years old when he was doing all this. And again, not just getting coffee or a supply bill. He was helping to run publicity with radio stations and stuff. But this was still kind of a new thing too. Comic-Con certainly was not the first convention. That would have been what's considered the first fan convention, and it was still more science fiction and a bit of cosplay, is the Worldcon in 1939 in New York. Worldcon, which continued to keep going in different versions throughout the years. I think it still goes on in some way even today. But and Sheldorf actually, even though he was originally from New York, I believe, he spent a lot of time in Detroit with his family before he came to San Diego. And in Detroit, he was helping to run something called the Detroit Triple Fan Fair. And that's been going on for a few years as well. And it's actually a big part of why, when he got to San Diego, he wanted to do something similar. So even Shell at Greater Comic-Con was influenced by an earlier one. So a lot of people think that San Diego was the first. It by far was not. And what's considered actually the first comic convention was not the New York Comic-Con now, which started in 2006, but an earlier version of the New York Comic-Con, which was something different, but it was also New York, that started in 1964. That's considered the first comic book convention. So you can go all the way back to 1939 for the first fan convention. You can
Mm-hmm.
go to 1964 for the first comic book convention. By the way, fun story there, only 65 people came. But the first person to have bought a ticket, according to record, was a young man who would become a writer later on in his life named George R.R. Martin. Yeah, that's written in the history books. Who knows if he was the first or fifth or just there, but
Yeah, but
he was the first person to buy a ticket to the first ever comic convention was George R.R. Martin, which I think says a lot about who these people are and who they end up being. And one thing I always like to tell people too is you know, that's why Comic-Con was so special is you look at the biographies in the back of the book, of which I
yes.
tried to be as extensive as possible. So much of this is about giving these people the much deserved spotlight that they get. So it's not a typical bio in the back where I have like one or two lines and that's it. Some of these bios are paragraph long. A lot of these people have done a lot of amazing things, and I really wanted as much of it in there as possible. But if you look at it, every single person who was involved in Comic-Con in the early days either became a writer, became an artist. Jim Valentino helped to create Image Comics. Dave Scroggie ended up helping to get Dark Horse really going. You had
Scott
people
Shaw,
filmmakers, Scott Shaw, who has worked in every possible pop culture field you can imagine, from comics to cartoons, Hanna-Barbera, Simpsons comics, everything else. So it really, and those who didn't, the few who didn't, became college professors or got very involved in electronics and computers. Everyone who was involved in this became something very creative, very innovative, and I would say 90% of them went into an artistic field very high up. Wendy All, the woman I talked about before, she went into toy design, and not just any toy design. She became a senior designer at friggin' Mattel and Hasbro, for goodness sakes. I mean, she was working at the highest levels that you can at toys. She was helping to do Barbie, for goodness sakes. And meanwhile, when she was a kid, she was helping making Comic-Con.
No, but sorry, I'm kind of going off the cuff here because I remember reading the story of they were trying to get science fiction writer Harlan Ellison to come. And there's a story, and there's a picture of Harlan Ellison holding her, and she's kind of smiling, but it kind of looks like
he's sort of grabbing her inappropriately. Yep. Yep. And you know what? And to her credit, she gave me that picture. She has nothing but fond things to say about Harlan. She's written about meeting him before. Wendy, like I said, is the one I've known the longest. We've known each other for 10 years. She is one of the sweetest, warmest, most generous people I've ever met. But you know what? She does not suffer fools. She's yelled at me before. I've heard her and seen her yell at other people. When Wendy gets mad, she gets mad. And so if she had any real problem with Harlan, she would certainly say it. And you're right. It's a picture that's, I have to admit, it looks a little inappropriate. That he's grabbing her in a weird way. And she was fairly young at the time. Although so was he still, kind of. So certainly not a photo that would probably fly in this day and age. Those are the kind, again, with the warts and all, those are the kinds of pictures and art. And there's a few others like that in there too. I mean, there's definitely some not safe for work stuff in there, listeners. I actually am going to be doing, as part of the tour that I've been doing for the last 6 weeks as well, I was invited to do something local around here in the Dayton, Ohio area as part of a library, as part of a teen comic day thing they're doing. And I actually told them, I said, I just want to be clear, there's some stuff in the book, both people talking about things and pictures and art that might not be appropriate for younger readers. And they said, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. I said, okay, but there's
they've seen worse on The Walking Dead. They've seen
you know what, unfortunately, for good or ill, I think that has a lot to do with it. They're like, these kids have seen everything at this point. Any kid with a cell phone has seen it all at this point. And, I wanted to make sure to get that stuff in there. I didn't want to censor anything. I mean, pretty much every photo, every piece of art, every story anybody told me, I put in, because I felt like that was my duty, was to, I've even, obviously not success or art or smarts or whatever, but style-wise, I compared myself to Andy Warhol as both a filmmaker and as a record producer. The story is, and if you see some of the footage of him doing it, it seems like it's true, that when he would make some of the films, at least the ones he was more directly involved in, not the Morrissey ones later on, but when he would make his films, or when he quote unquote produce the Velvet Underground's album, that his thing was basically just to kind of walk away. And that's sort of my jam here. Is I wanted to create the space, I wanted to create the platform, I wanted to kind of design the book and earlier the podcast in a way that would really give them the freedom to say whatever they wanted, to do whatever they wanted. And I really didn't turn anything down unless there was an issue that was a legal issue, or with the photos and art, of course, like anything with credits. I feel really bad that we weren't able to get in any pictures of Brink Stevens, for example.
Oh my God.
Brink Stevens is amazing. She's another one I've become really close with. I love Brink. She also was nice enough to do some narration for the podcast series. She did that totally on her own for free. It was so nice of her to do that. I wrote what she said, but she was very helpful with that. But there's no pictures of Brink in there, even though she was one of the early Comic-Con people. She ran the Masquerade for years. She was Dave Stevens' widow. Dave actually used her as a model for Betty, along with, of course, Betty Page, who she did and does look like Betty Page already. Brink's an exceptionally beautiful woman. And later became, what she refers to as one of the original screen queens. Being in movies like Sleepaway, Summer Party Massacre, and things like that. And so I would have loved to have had pictures of Brink in there. The problem was all the pictures she sent me were clearly very professionally done. And I was worried like they were from magazines or from other things. And I didn't want to cause any issues for me, for my publisher, or anyone else. So I was very meticulous. That was really what took the most amount of time, was getting the pictures, organizing the pictures, and making sure they were all credited appropriately, and identifying as many of the people in them as possible. And I understand from people who are very curmudgeonly and meticulous and persnickety, all these old Comic-Con people who, again, do not suffer fools gladly. There's a reason a book like this has never come out before, because they didn't really want to let anyone do it, because they were worried it would get screwed up. But they trusted me because the podcast was so good. But, from what I understand, there's like one or two very minor errors with the photos that I didn't catch, or that maybe somebody who gave me the picture, they got it wrong, which is honestly probably the case, because I don't know who these people are in a lot of pictures. I had to go with whoever took the picture or whatever. So the point is, it seems like they're all right. And I think that says a lot about the how meticulous we were about making sure everything was right. Because I didn't want to piss anybody off. And I knew these are the people, Scott Shaw, Wendy, others, who if they see something that's wrong, they will point it out and they will really focus on it. I didn't want that to happen with this book. I wanted everything to be as right as possible. I went through the drafts. You're right. It's like 500 pages. It was a lot. Probably 10 or 15 times, making sure every word was right, making sure every name was spelled correctly. Every Klingonese Klingon word was spelled right, and all these weird like science fiction and fantasy. Some of these things like these planets, and it's like I want to make sure when they're talking about something, everything was right.
And then the thing I just want to let listeners know, because like I said, reading this book, as Matt said, it's an oral history, because I remember Brink Stevens. Oh my God. I still remember one of her famous covers from Femme Fatale magazine back in the 80s. Oh my God. And those of you who remember her as the original Scream Queen, I just thought she was this beautiful actress who's not going to be interested in science fiction. And she's just an actress. In the book, oh my God, she's a she studied to be a marine biologist.
Yeah, she almost got her PhD.
And she loves science fiction. She read Robert Heinlein. She talked about how she was like literally an outcast in her high school. And I'm kind of going, wait, you, this beautiful woman that I've seen, in pictures in the 80s, was an outcast because you love science fiction. You're a bull, and I'm kind of going, oh my God, it's like us, like you and me, Matt. Like you love, monster stuff, and me, comics, science fiction. We were like outcasts, and here Shell comes and goes, let's make this, let's do this convention thing. And holy cow, they had Greg Bear, who's a science fiction writer, and oh my God. But it's amazing to learn of how many people were involved in those early days.
Brink's a really amazing person, and from what she's talked about, she has a very high IQ, which I very much believe. She's done so much, and she's very intelligent and articulate when you talk to her. And you're right. In fact, I don't want to put this on her. We've never really talked about it, but a few other people have, including some of the other women, frankly. But, you know, a lot of people feel that she might not have known or understood how alluring and beautiful she was when she was younger, because she was this outcast who had skipped a bunch of grades, and who, as she talks about, people would throw her books in the trash
Yes.
and write on her lockers. She was the local nerd.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people speculate that one of the reasons why Brink is so cool, and why she got in with this group of other misfits and weirdos, despite the fact that she was, you know, very attractive, was she just might not have really understood that, because she was always the nerd who was bullied well into, you know, late high school and early college, before she, you know, kind of came to terms with the fact that, oh, you know, aside from being very smart and very capable and very interested in science and science fiction, I have this other quality that, you know, maybe I didn't realize at first, which is that, you know, I have a certain look that allows me to become a model and allows me to become an actress. The fact that she happens to also be very good at it says a lot. And look, you know, here we are 50 years later. She's well into her 70s now, and she's still doing it. I mean, she was making movies well through COVID. I mean, Mark Evanier says it in the book, and I looked it up. He's not exaggerating. She's made like 400 films or something like that. And she's probably made like 10 in the last year or two. I mean, granted, they're like sub Trauma. And we did get Uncle Lloyd Kaufman from Trauma in there as well. But they are like kind of, you know, she would even say, you know, they're not even B movies, they're C and D oftentimes. But she's been in a lot of other
She's
been in TV, and she's been in documentaries, and, you know, Brink's one of those people, she loves working and she loves doing what she does. And the fact that she worked so hard, even on the podcast series that we did first, Comic Con Begins, which if anyone wants to listen to as well, it's free on all audio platforms. Even though we partnered with SiriusXM and Stitcher, which they had just purchased at the time, it's available free everywhere. But Brink worked really hard and did a lot of recording for us. I mean, it's a lot of material, and had to be, you know, sometimes we had to do extra takes and all this. So Brink's just one of those people, and she's done her own comic books, she's done her own books, she's directed her own films, she's done a lot. I mean, Brink's an amazing person. She's really a hero of mine, and I love just talking to her. I hit her up just the other day, actually, and I'm very proud of the fact that she's still working well into today, and rightly so. I mean, she's probably working on a movie right now as we speak.
All right. Matt, we've got literally about 5 minutes left. The thing is, you know, oh my, and listeners, like I said, we
can talk forever. That's
just
for sure.
The tip of the iceberg, because I mean, you know, because I really want to talk to Matt about the early days of the mini con. Oh my God, this book is incredible. I mean, the pool parties, but then also too, the cool thing about the U.S. Grant Hotel was one of the locations, and I love that Brink was also the host of the Comic-Con TV, and that was a closed circuit hotel channel that they could broadcast stuff, the convention from the inside the hotel. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, that was mostly at the El Cortez. They kind of bounced back and forth to a few different locations in the first couple of years, but throughout most of the 70s, they were at a place called the El Cortez, which everyone who's involved in the book, and even some of the creators and fans that I talked to as well, who weren't necessarily involved in the creation of Comic-Con, but were very much present there for a lot of this, like Sergio Aragones, for example. You know, it was so cool to get to talk to and become friendly with over this period. Everyone agrees that was sort of the quote unquote golden era of Comic-Con, where it was sort of a good collusion of, it had been going for a few years, it had been fairly established, they had a nice number of people there, a few thousand people. There were people coming from all over the country, all over the world, folks coming from Japan, Europe, Mexico, all over. You know, that's how a lot of the anime and manga stuff came in, and the guys, the gang from, you know, Heavy Metal in 2000 AD and Mobius and people like this. And people coming up from Mexico and things like that. So from all over the world to Thailand and Philippines and everywhere, Russia and whatever, and or at the time Soviet Union. But so, you know, they were bringing all these different artists, all these different filmmakers, all these different creators together, science fiction people, and hanging out at this hotel, the El Cortez, which, from what everyone's talked about, from what I've seen from pictures and things, was this kind of ramshackle building that sounds like it was ready to collapse and should have been condemned. but really became their home. And they were,
Yes.
and it had this big glass elevator that they would ride up in and
Yes.
moon everybody. And I mean, the way I've been describing that part of the Comic-Con story, and if ever hint, 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 there were to be a movie made of all this, I would definitely focus on that period, and I would refer to it as Boogie Nights meets Revenge of the Nerds. And I think that a lot of the
Oh my
people
God.
involved would agree with that. And one or two who I've kind of said that to, they're like, "Oh, that's exactly what it was." It was the '70s. Everyone's
Yes.
young. You talked about
Sex,
pool
drugs, and
parties.
rock and roll.
Not everyone was wearing clothes. There was obviously drinking, drugs, rock and roll. People were protesting, Vietnam and such, and all this, and there was a lot. You had the underground comics people coming down.
Yes.
They're hanging out. I mean, even people like Sergio, people like Spain Rodriguez and Trina Robbins, and these are counterculture people. I mean, some of the younger Comic-Con kids even like Scott Shaw, who's pretty big and has always been pretty big. Talks about being a little intimidated by these people. I mean, they weren't just the heroes of theirs; they were a little scared of them. I mean, these are people who are writing about and making comics with an X about, and writing stories and things about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and violence, and war, and protests, and all this, that, and the other, coming and hanging out with them for the weekend at this weird, shitty hotel that they were able to get because it's the only one they could afford, and they turned it into their own utopia. They turned it into their own fan geek, island, their own island of misfit toys, and that's really what it was. And it's beautiful, and everyone across the board, and this is important too, women as well as men, all said it was completely a safe place. Nobody has any negative stories about being, made to feel uncomfortable, being, like, who knows if any of that stuff happened? I certainly can't say, but it really sounds like it really didn't, like zero, like not even a little bit. And I talked to every possible person that you could talk to who was there, even people who aren't in the podcast or book, people that I talked to on the side. I had the good fortune of having an email exchange with Art Spiegelman, for example, of Mouse fame, of course, and others. There are a few people who chose to not be involved, but they were supportive, and I would ask them questions. And people I've met on this tour, I've done a lot of stuff with Trina Robbins, and trust me, and Trina's written her own memoir, which I highly recommend, that also came out through Fantagraphics just recently, Last Girl Standing. If anyone was going to say anything negative happened, especially to women, it would be Trina. And Trina has no negative stories at all. She doesn't have a single one of someone touched me or someone touched her, or someone did this or that. It really sounds like, as wild and crazy and out of hand as it could be, everyone was there to support each other. Everyone was there to make it a safe, welcoming, inclusive place. They had, again, early manga, early anime, Howard Cruz, who was doing some of the first gay comics, other people from the LGBTQ community coming very early on. I mean, it's just something, and people from different politics. There were conservative people. There were people, and not everybody was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Some people, didn't like that stuff, but they were able to be there too. It was really a place that brought together everybody. And I know we're wrapping up here, and I think this is, a good thing to say toward the end. And I've written about this and talked about this. I think that's what's so beautiful about this, and why so much of this resonates. I think it also goes to why almost all these people are still friends with each other. These are people who literally grew up with each other. These are people who've known each other since they were 12, 13 years old. Some of them are in their 80s now. They're still very close friends. You throw in someone like Floyd Norman, the first black animator for Disney. He literally worked on Snow White and Cinderella, the originals. I mean, that's he's still working today. Great guy. He's kind of part of this scene. He was one of the people, again, not in the book or podcast, but I've gotten very friendly with. He's been very supportive. And all these, they're all still friends. They're Floyd's 90 and he's still with these people. And I think a lot of that's because they really loved each other. They had their fights, they had their bickering. They're human beings. But at the end of the day, this sounds like it was a very special place. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, he recently said in his memoir that just came out that Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, is the closest thing he's ever experienced to utopia ever. And that's coming from a scientist. And so I think that says a lot about what's so special about this, and why, especially right now, when things are so messed up, and there's a lot of division, and there's a lot of people fighting with each other, and there's a lot of anger and fear and anxiety. it's why telling stories like this and getting stuff like this out there is so friggin' important, to remind people that, you know, skin color and religion and background and politics and sexual identity and all these other things, you know, there are places that we can come to where we can all agree and say, hey, you know, let's talk about Star Wars, let's talk about Batman, let's talk about Twilight Zone, let's talk about Rick and Morty, let's, you know, let's discuss these things and be there together despite our backgrounds and whatnot. And I think that's really beautiful and important. I don't think it's escaping, and I don't think it's a distraction. I don't think it's looking the other way. These are all people right now, even, who are very engaged in politics, very interested in what's going on in the world. These are not people who are letting that stuff go. They're not ignoring what's going on in the world, but they're coming to a place for each other and for their mental health and for, you know, humanity as a whole, all over the world. It's San Diego Comic-Con International now. It's literally what it's called. Of let's come together and find where we can connect. And if that happens to be on Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, so be it. You know, let's not worry about that other stuff for a minute. Let's just come together and find where we can connect. And that's in storytelling and art and creativity. And that is what this has all been about for me, and why I think this is a very important story, especially for right now.
Matthew, I want to say mahalo. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you about this important book, this amazing book. You know, I wish you all the success for the book. Again, listeners, it's See You at San Diego, an oral history of Comic-Con, Fandom, and the Triumph of Geek Culture by Fantagraphics. It's available on Amazon right now. Now, listeners, if you've already picked up,
it's everywhere. People can order it everywhere. You know, I always tell people, support your local bookstore, support your local comic book shop. If you do get it on Amazon, though, even if you don't, and Jason, I've told you this too, so hopefully you can do it also. We can use as many reviews on Amazon as possible. It really helps to push the recommendation algorithm. So even if you get it at your local bookstore, which I hope you do, still do a review on Amazon, because it really helps.
All right. And then I also want to thank Hannah of Superfan Promotions, and I also want to give John Suntress of Word Balloon a big shout out to, because when I saw you on John's podcast right before the book came out, I said, "Oh my God, I got to get Matthew on."
Yeah, John's great. John really believes in what he does. John and I have become extremely close over the last few years. This is not the first time he's interviewed me for a project. And I was actually connected to him through Aftershock when I did You're Obsolete. And what they said was, this guy sells books. You got to talk to him. I said, okay. We had a great conversation. And we became friends. He invited me through a friend of his to the convention in Connecticut, Terrificon, and we did a panel there, which was great. And since then, we've become friends. I'm actually helping him with another project he's working on. John's one of the true real guys, and if anyone's not familiar with Word Balloon, they should definitely listen to it, because he gets all the big names on there. He really is one of the key people in the podcast realm for this kind of stuff. So John's great.
And as he always calls himself, he's one of the original Mercury astronauts.
Yeah, I can understand that.
So now, if you are a new comic book reader, and of course a convention goer, please pick up this book. Again, it's See You at San Diego, an oral history of Comic-Con, Fandom, and the Triumph of Geek Culture. I just have to say, I love how the format is. It's an oral history, like me and Matt had talked about before we started recording. It's like you're sitting in the room listening to, some of the original committee members, listening to, and Matt got like Frank Miller. I love hearing the stories of from Bruce Campbell, but also too, I love some of the original committee members talking about how some young kid in the 70s came up to go, hey, I did this movie. I can probably bring a clip to show it at this convention, and it was Mark Hamill. And that's amazing. Or you could read the incredible story of how Neil Gaiman had talked about the panel, one of the recent Comic-Con panels, where I think they forgot how to have a way for him to exit out of the room. And I think one of the organizers had to find like these cosplayers that are like 6+ dressed as Klingons to give him like lined up for him to give them away to get out of the
That's one of my favorite stories for sure. Is we did get Neil Gaiman. Neil's been great. I was actually just talking with one of his assistants earlier today about some stuff. Neil's been one of the people who's been really supportive of this project since day one when we were still doing the podcast. And Neil tells a very funny story about how they were worried that he wouldn't be able to get out without getting mobbed by the audience. So they just brought together a bunch of people cosplaying as Klingons who were really tall and big to basically escort him out so that he wouldn't get mobbed. And as he says, that's just classic, Comic-Con logic. And Neil's got, as you said, most of the book, a lot of the focus is on the early Comic-Con people. They're the ones that I talked to the longest and had the most time, frankly. I mean, Neil's not somebody who has 3 hours that he can do an interview, doing a million interviews a day while he's doing all these TV shows and books and such. But he gave us a good interview, and he had a lot of really funny, interesting stories. And some of them are not so funny. He was another one who he's got some sad stories about Kirby. He's got some sad stories about how Comic-Con has changed a lot over the years, how it's a lot less intimate now. Other people feel that that's a good thing because it's bigger, so it brings in more people. So, again, it's a lot of different voices. But Neil's definitely one of the ones who he respects and appreciates and loves Comic-Con. But he, like a few other people, wishes it was still a little bit more intimate and one-on-one, and people could really kind of hang out with each other. And that he certainly can't do that anymore because, he would get mobbed. And even, frankly, I don't think I'm giving anything too much away with this, but one of the reasons Mark Hamill can't really go anymore is for that, especially with his age and whatnot. Like he can't. I mean, but as they say too, I think it was Scott Aukerman who we also talked to from Comedy Bang Bang and Earwolf and all that, and also writes X-Men and other things. He said, he knows for a fact, and I'm sure everyone's heard this, that, that like Jack Black will go and wear a Stormtrooper helmet. So you never know who's next to you in a cosplay. It might be a celebrity but that also says a lot about, like, even for people like that, they want to go to Comic-Con and they want to really see it and enjoy it as a fan and not be mobbed and not be bothered. Like, it's something they want to go to too, and kind of be left alone to just check stuff out. And so so that's another reason to go to Comic-Con, kids, is you never know who's standing next to you waiting in line. It might be someone that you are a fan of and just is wearing a mask so that they're hidden away. So
all right, so I want to thank Drew, the host of Comics for Fun and Profit, for putting this episode together. So Drew, thank you very much for all your hard work behind the scenes. And if you are a new listener, please check out new episodes of Comics for Fun and Profit. Before I do my closing line, I just want to end this with Bring Stevens and her quote. I had to cut her quote. I had to make it short, and I love it because it just nails how Comic-Con was created from the past to the present. It's just amazing to me that this little group of teenagers had created something that is so huge, so world famous now. It's astonishing to me that we didn't know what we were doing. We just wanted to do something, and this is what happened. And that's true. Listeners, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to this episode. Again, Matthew, thank you very much. I know we're going a little bit over. Until next time, guys, aloha.
Our LCS is Cowabunga Comics out of Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and their mail order company, Deep Discount Comics. And we went there, and we were actually invoice number 00001. We were the very first their very first customer, which was kind of cool. They've been nothing short of fantastic, customer service wise. Discounts, they were very close, if not the same or better than DCBS on a lot of things. Over and above, customer service wise, always taking care of us, going the extra mile, so responsive, getting instantaneous responses back to questions about things, and to the point where knowing the stuff you like and anticipating your needs and having it suggested that you might want to add this to your order already before you even have to think about it. That's kind of cool. Really quality experience. So we love working with Cowabunga and Deep Discount, and that's why they're in our show notes every single episode, and have been for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes. That we leave them there because we like them. They're cool, good people. That's why they're in there. By God, they'd tell you to, if you've got a local comic book shop that you love, stay with them, because everybody needs to support their local comic shops. But if you're looking, check them out. You can check them out in the show notes. There's plenty of ways to get a hold of them. Either get on their list, just so you can check and see what kind of FOC and pre-order stuff they have and the discounts, and they'll send it to you each month, get you on that email list. And you can check out their shop, because they have a great shop of exclusive Cowabunga variants. Amazing stuff. Yes, they've always been there for us, and we take them for granted. So there you go. Now you know.